going back to Russian scientist Dmitry Mendeleev, who is reputed to have published the first scientific table of the elements, used a card game to figure out the layout of the table, which could be considered the first documented use of gamification to fulfill an educational goal.
Within all forms of education, there are extrinsic and intrinsic motivators. Studies have shown, though, that intrinsic motivation rather than extrinsic motivation is linked to deeper sustained learning, self-sustained learning by students, and hence creativity. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, requires an external source. So, for example, if a student only completes their homework because their parents are putting pressure on them, once that external source of motivation disappears, students are no longer motivated to learn, and they'll put less work in.
What are some ways that gamification can hinder learning?
Well, according to the Cornell Chronicle, educational games that aren't effective focus too much on the gameplay rather than the actual learning. They list Duolingo as an example. Duolingo has a lot of badges, it has a lot of leaderboards that do motivate people to continue with the app, but don't necessarily foster a love of learning languages. Other examples are apps that give vague feedback. The more specific and actionable the feedback is, the better the learning. Factors such as overcompetitiveness in games, such as like Kahoot, can also kill motivation in students. If they don't perform well, they might get discouraged.
So what ways can gamification be used to sustain motivation and lifelong learning?
Okay, well, the Smithsonian Center actually outlines 5 major benefits to the gamification of learning. One of these benefits is that it aids in cognitive development, particularly with so-called brain games, which improve the processing and retention power of the brain. Secondly, it can aid in physical development and health, particularly with interactive exercise in specific games. Number 3 is that it increases the level of engagement in the classroom in terms of productivity. Fourth is that it aids in accessibility in the classroom for students who have specific needs. And lastly, it is a useful aid outside of the classroom. For instance, parents helping or encouraging their children with homework by creating level-up style games in which they can uncover a clue after solving a math problem.
How can gamification in education connect to autonomy in the way we use technology in the classroom?
I'd like to backtrack regarding autonomy and explain its importance in education. Autonomy is a critical aspect for engaging students in their learning. In its most positive aspect, gamification isn't just about making learning more entertaining. It's about creating environments where students feel safe to experiment, where they have autonomy, and where they feel seen and respected as individuals. When students can bring their own creativity and identity into learning, that's when education becomes truly meaningful for them. There's a really interesting TED Talk by Scott Hebert about the power of gamification. One of the things he points out is that traditional schooling often removes the element of fun. Instead of discovery, learning gets transferred into worksheets, straight lines, and rigid structures. And when that happens, something that should feel engaging starts to be tedious. As a science teacher, he stripped down his classroom and he asked the students what they wanted to have in the classroom. Students started building their own furniture for the classroom, and he had a lot of pushback regarding his teaching, but he stayed with the interests of the students, and the students were very passionate about their learning. I think that this is really important, especially in the climate right now that we have in modern education. To have that kind of engagement will also help teachers connect with students, and this really connects to the summer model. Gamification can be made on the level of, it doesn't have to require technology necessarily, but the summer model specifically outlines how greater engagement can be made with technology. On the higher levels of the SAMR model, I'll list all of them. There's initially substitution and augmentation, but then there's also modification and redefinition. And Ruben Puentadura, who created the SAMR model, emphasized that teachers at any level can use the technology, but the one which can essentially possibly be the most engaging for students is when through technology students can socially interact with each other, where they can create projects online. And this element of creation seems to be the most exciting for students. How can gamification be used as a practice for social justice?
So there's an article by Skillman in 2023, and he mentions a game called Papers, Please. And it's basically a game where you play as an immigration officer. So there's so many different decisions that students can make, and there's conflict between job loyalty and resisting that job loyalty for, let's say, moral principles. The game teaches students about injustices, especially regarding oppression that certain groups, certain immigrant groups may face, such as ableism, sexism, racism, xenophobia, transphobia, etc. And it also tries to challenge students' biases and even common sense, right? Because students will learn from each other and will try to understand different perspectives of their classmates. Also, it challenges common sense because we are gaining knowledge explicitly from the lived experiences of minority groups.
So how can we go from gamification to student creation in the classroom?
One way I thought about was, let's say, for example, educating students about propaganda. Students can create propaganda through their learned experiences in class and present it to class. And then after, students can assess their each other's propaganda.
For the last question, is there unequal access to gamification?
Yes, there is most definitely a digital divide in gamification. We can think of it in terms of certain schools not having equal funding. Certain students will come from a different level playing field. And so a way we can address this is, first of all, to to teach students kind of like the basics of technology use, so everyone can start off on a level playing field.